Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. In those days, there were oceans of light, and cities in the skies, and wild flying beasts of bronze. There were herds of crimson cattle that roared and were taller than castles. There were shrill viridian things that haunted bleak rivers. It was a time of gods, manifesting themselves upon our world in all her aspects. A time of giants who walked on water, of mindless sprites and misshapen creatures, who could be summoned by an ill-considered thought, but driven away only on pain of some fearful sacrifice. Of magics, phantasms, unstable natures, impossible events, insane paradoxes, dreams come true, dreams gone awry, of nightmares assuming reality. It was a rich time and a dark time. The time of the sword rulers. The time when the Vadach and the Nadrach, age-old enemies, were dying. The time when man, the slave of fear, was emerging, unaware that much of the terror he experienced was the result of nothing else but the fact that he, himself, had come into existence. It was one of the many ironies connected with man, who in those days called his race Mabden. The Mabden lived brief lives and bred prodigiously. Within a few centuries, they rose to dominate the westerly continent on which they had evolved. Superstition stopped them from sending many of their ships toward Vadach and Nadrach lands for another century or two, but gradually they gained courage when no resistance was offered. They began to feel jealous of the older races. They began to feel malicious. The Vadach and the Nadrach were not aware of this. They had dwelt 1,000,000 or more years upon the planet which now at last seemed at rest. They knew of the Mabden, but considered them not greatly different from other beasts. Though continuing to indulge their traditional hatreds of one another, the Vadach and the Nadrach spent their long hours in considering abstractions, in the creations of works of art and the like. Rational, sophisticated, at one with themselves, these older races were unable to believe in the changes that had come. Thus, as it almost always is, they ignored the signs. There was no exchange of knowledge between the two ancient enemies, even though they had fought their last battle many centuries ago. The Vadach lived in family groups, occupying isolated castles scattered across a continent called by them Broan Vadach. There was scarcely any communication between these families, for the Vadach had long since lost the impulse to travel. The Nadrach lived in their cities, built on the islands in the seas to the northwest of Broan Vadach. They also had little contact, even with their closest kin. Both races reckoned themselves invulnerable. Both were wrong. Upstart man was beginning to breed and spread like a pestilence across the world. This pestilence struck down the old races wherever it touched them. And it was not only death that man brought, but terror too. Willfully he made of the older world nothing but ruins and bones. Unwittingly, he brought psychic and supernatural disruption of a magnitude which even the great old gods failed to comprehend. And the great old gods began to know fear. And man, slave of fear, arrogant in his ignorance, continued his stumbling progress. He was blind to the huge disruptions aroused by his apparently petty ambitions. As well, man was deficient in sensitivity, had no awareness of the multitude of dimensions that filled the universe, each plane intersecting with several others. Not so the Vadach nor the Nadrach, who had known what it was to move at will between the dimensions they termed the 5 planes. They had glimpsed and understood the nature of many planes other than the 5 through which the earth moved. Therefore, it seemed a dreadful injustice that these wise races should perish at the hands of creatures who were still little more than animals. It was as if vultures feasted on and squabbled over the paralyzed body of the youthful poet, who could only stare at them with puzzled eyes as they slowly robbed him of an exquisite existence they would never appreciate, never know they were taking. If they valued what they stole, if they knew what they were destroying, says an old Vadach in the story The Only Autumn Flower, then I would be consoled. It was unjust. By creating man, the universe had betrayed the old races. But it was a perpetual and familiar injustice. The sentient may perceive and love the universe, but the universe cannot perceive and love the sentient. The universe sees no distinction between the multitude of creatures and elements which comprise it. All are equal. None is favored. The universe, equipped with nothing but the materials and the power of creation, continues to create. Something of this, something of that. It cannot control what it creates, and it cannot, it seems, be controlled by its creations, though a few might deceive themselves otherwise. Those who curse the workings of the universe curse that which is deaf. Those who strike out at those workings fight that which is inviolate. Those who shake their fists at blind stars. But this does not mean that there are some who will not try to do battle with and destroy the invulnerable. There will always be such beings, sometimes beings of great wisdom, who cannot bear to believe in an insouciant universe. Prince Corum Jalen Irsay was one of these. Perhaps the last of the Vadach race, he was sometimes known as the Prince in the Scarlet Robe. This video concerns him. Welcome, friends, once again to the Moorcock Multiverse. As with the Elric video, there will be some degree of lore involved, but because world building was not Moorcock's focus, this is mostly going to be an introduction to specifically the character of Corum, the Prince in the Scarlet Robe. Again, like Elric, this is mostly going to be in service of getting people interested into reading his story. As such, though I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum, this will involve spoiling at least a third, if not half, of the first Corum book, The Knight of the Swords. In the spirit of that, I'm also, from now on, whenever discussing an Eternal Champion, recommend some of the books about him that you can find and where to start. While the story of Elric has been told mostly in dozens of short stories, most of which were later collated and combined into full novels, Corum has 6 books ascribed to him, not counting his occasional bit parts in crossover events like The Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Another fun little crossover, albeit a much briefer one, occurs in the Elric story The Vanishing Tower, which happens to coincide with the events of the 3rd Corum book, The King of the Swords. Both stories feature a sequence where it's the same event, just told from the perspectives of 2 different characters. As Eternal Champions go, Corum isn't nearly as angst-ridden and moribund as Elric, though certainly he does have his share of angst. But that just comes with the job of being the Eternal Champion. Much like Elric, Corum also possesses, especially initially, a strong sense of morality and idealism, things that take quite a hell of a beating considering what happens to him early on in the story. The Corum saga, as I've said, is 6 books divided into 2 trilogies. The Swords trilogy, The Knight of the Swords, The Queen of the Swords, and The King of the Swords, all written in 1971, and the Silver Hand trilogy, The Bull and the Spear, The Oak and the Ram, and The Sword and the Stallion, written between 1973 and 1974. Alas, while the Elric books have gotten some good new additions, including some excellent audiobook collections narrated by Samuel Rauken, none of the other Eternal Champions have received such fine treatment as yet. That said, at this time, Corum does boast something that even Elric can't. Full cast audio adaptations of all 6 books, including sound effects and music in the background, courtesy of GraphicAudio. This video isn't sponsored by them, though I certainly wouldn't mind it if they did, because it's one of the few things that I feel like I could recommend, honestly, without feeling the need to wash my mouth out with soap afterwards. Their Corum books are genuinely good. And although sometimes the dialogue is a little melodramatic and exposition-y, that's because this format that GraphicAudio uses is essentially that of an old radio play. And so sometimes you do need the characters to kind of explain to the listener things they can't see. so if the original books aren't enough for you, I recommend giving these a spin. And if anyone from GraphicAudio happens to be listening, that was for free. I'll be willing to do a lot more if you'd pay me for it. But anyway, Prince Corum. The world of Prince Corum is mostly referred to as the 15 Planes. Literally 15 different realities layered atop one another. Corum and his people were always aware of them, but could only travel, by mystic means, through 5 of them, including the one that they lived on most of the time. And it's this first plane, the closest thing in the Prince Corum series to reality, that gets any kind of description. And even then, it's not really much, as only 2 continents are ever mentioned by name, Broan Mabdin and Broan Vadak. Originally, the 15 planes were ruled over by the Lords of Law, specifically 3 of them, each governing 5 of the 15 planes, although only one of them, Lord Arkan, is actually named, and he governed over the 5 planes that Corum and his people could perceive. Prior to the coming of man, 3 races were known to live on this world: the Ragada Keta, the Vadach, and the Nadrach. But then came the Lords of Chaos, who overthrew the respective Lords of Law and each claimed 5 of the 15 planes for themselves. In this part of the multiverse, they were also known as the Sword Rulers. Mavaloda the Faceless, the King of the Swords, took 5, Shambarg, the Queen of the Swords, took another 5, and the last 5 that were ruled over by Arkan of Law were claimed by Ariok. In another part of the multiverse, he is the patron of the Melnibonean Empire and one of the greatest of the Lords of Chaos. In the Corum series, he is a 3rd-string player bearing the title the Knight of the Swords. It seems the Ragada Keta, a spindly race with features that essentially look like surprise bowling balls, were aware of the Lords of Chaos in general, and Ariok in particular early on, and very quickly submitted rather than be destroyed, even though they know that because they are a creation of law like the others, eventually Ariok is going to get around to destroying them. But the Ragada Keta, it seems, are a very fatalistic race, for they wait, trembling but passively, for the day of their destruction. As for the Vadach and Nadrach, it seemed that they mostly remained ignorant of the transition from rule by the Lords of Law to the Lords of Chaos, probably because they were too busy fighting each other. The Nadrach are described as a fairly hairy race, essentially covered in fur, and they inhabited densely populated cities on a series of islands to the northwest of the continent of Broan Vadach. The Vadach were more your stereotypical, slightly elfin elder race. They don't have pointy ears, but their ears do taper, and they don't have lobes like humans do. Appearance-wise, they mostly resemble European humans, although their skin apparently has golden sparkles in certain lights, which is dangerously close to Twilight territory for my liking. However, the really distinctive feature that sets them apart is that their irises are gold, and the eyeball itself is colored purple, and when angered, these colors change respectively to red and black. For their part, the Vadach lived in these very small family groups that lived in these tiny, isolated castles, scattered across Broan Vadach. And so, while these 2 elder races were warring with one another, the Lords of Chaos established themselves to their satisfaction in their new domain, and Ariok decided to create a new race of his own to eventually eradicate the creations of Arkan. And thus he brought into being man, also known in this universe as the Mabdin. Unlike the elder races, the Mabdin had little gift for magic and no ability to sense the other planes beyond the one they physically interacted with. They lived short lives, they bred like rabbits, and were so primitive that when they initially encountered them, the elder races viewed them as little more than animals. For their part, the Mabdin initially feared the Vadach and Nadrach as gods, but eventually discovered that these races, for all their power and sophistication, were very mortal. And so that disappointment of the revelation turned to envy and resentment. Some Mabdin got over this and became somewhat civilized, modeling their culture off of these sophisticated elder races. Others, however, clung to that resentment and hatred, allowing it to fester. Meanwhile, eventually, the Vadach and Nadrach decided to stop fighting each other, and for centuries lived in peace, pretty much ignoring one another. The Nadrach kept to their island cities, while the Vadach retreated into their small family castles. In fact, the Vadach became not only distant from the world and their old enemies, but from each other. Contact and communication between the various Vadach family groups and their castles effectively ceased, as, like so many stereotypical elder races in fantasy and sci-fi, they became increasingly introspective, increasingly disconnected from the world around them. And all the while, the Mabdin were crossing the ocean from their original continent, Broan Mabdin, to Broan Vadach. And those who harbored in their hearts a hatred of the elder races began to perform the task for which Ariok had created them: the destruction of the old world and the old races. The Nadrach were the first. The islands were overrun, and those few that weren't killed outright were reduced to slavery, used by the Mabdin to hunt down their old enemy, the Vadach, so that they in turn could be destroyed. Thus, one by one, the individual isolated Vadach castles fell, and their inhabitants slaughtered and mutilated in hideous ways. And of course, because again, they didn't talk to each other anymore, the other Vadach were never aware of what was going on until the barbarians were literally at their own gates. And so each castle in isolation fell, with the others never the wiser. And it is during this final phase of the effective genocide of the Vadach race that we encounter Prince Corum. Born long after the end of the Vadach-Nadrach Wars, Prince Corum lived all his life in Castle Aerorn with his family. Though once occupied by 500, by now only 12 inhabited the castle. Its lord, Prince Klonsky, the father of Corum, along with Corum's mother, his 2 sisters, his uncle, his female cousin, and 5 distant kinsmen who served as retainers. Like all Vadach in those twilight days, Corum and his family spent their time in introspection and artistic pursuits, neither knowing nor much caring about the world beyond the walls of Castle Aerorn. However, one day, Prince Klonsky approached his son with a task. The old man had noticed that his sensitivity to the 5 planes was weakening. It took greater and greater effort than usual to both perceive and transition among the planes. And this was more than just the fact that he was very old. Other members of the family had reported the same increasing difficulty. Seeking answers, Prince Klonsky, for the first time in probably centuries, tried to reach out to other Vadach princes to see if they might have any answers for him, but he couldn't find any. There was simply no response to his magical hails. And so he sent Corum, his young fit son, out to some of the other distant kinsmen in other castles to see if perhaps what had happened to them and if they might have answers for this increasing lack of ability to perceive and transition through the planes. And so, wearing a silver helm, carrying a traditional Vadach hand axe, and wearing the scarlet robe that would become his signature, Prince Corum set out on horseback from Castle Aerorn to find answers. On his quest, he noted the increasing number of Mabdin communities in Broan Vadach. Of course, in those days, the Vadach viewed the Mabdin as little more than animals, and so for Corum this was merely a curiosity. However, the Mabdin, those that he encountered directly, seemed afraid of him, referring to him and his people as Shathanho, an old word for demon or fiend. Eventually, Corum found the first of the castles that his father had sent him to find, only to find it was in ruins. There were no signs of life, but plenty of signs of violence. And so Corum moved on to the next castle, only to find it in the same condition. Increasingly worried and fearful, the prince traveled, but no matter where he went, no matter which castle he went to, it was always the same: ruins and death. At the last one, he discovered a dying Nadrach, abandoned amidst the ruin. The Nadrach revealed that he had been a slave to a group of Mabdin who had used him to track down the old enemy of his race and destroy them. As far as the dying man knew, there were no more Vadach left in Broan Vadach. Consumed with fear, Corum turned and rode as fast as he could for home, but when he returned to Castle Aerorn, he was too late. A large warband of Mabdin warriors were despoiling his ancestral home. His family were all dead. The women had been raped before they'd been killed. And so Prince Corum learned what it was to hate. Soon after, he learned what it was to kill, for he attempted to avenge his dead family, but he was overpowered. The leader of the war band, calling himself Earl Glendith Acrai, leader of the Denledesi, informed the wounded prince that he was now the last of his kind, and as such, unlike the rest of his family, the Mabden intended to savor his death, make it long and slow as they could manage. They started by cutting off his left hand and gouging out his right eye. In desperation, the Vadach prince used his ability to move between the planes, seeming to disappear before the astonished eyes of his torturers. The Denledesi scattered into the woods to search for him, but in truth, Corum was still exactly where he was, tied to a board, just on a different plane of existence. And it was only a matter of time before his will failed him and he returned to his own plane, becoming fully visible to the Mabden. Luckily for the last of the Vadach, intervention came in the form of a strange brown hairy ape-like creature known only as the Brown Man of Lar. He loosed the Vadach prince's bonds and then carried him many miles to a place called Moidal's Mount. There too lived Mabden, but of a far more civilized and less genocidal type. Mabden, who bore no ill will towards the elder races, and indeed welcomed Corum into their midst, tending to his wounds and helping him regain his strength. Although, of course, replacing an eye and a hand was a little bit beyond their abilities. And so, despite his initial mistrust and hostility, they were Mabden after all, like the ones that had killed his family, Corum did begin to settle down at Moidal's Mount, and even fell in love with its ruler, the widowed Margravine Lady Ralina of Alonglil. Alas, inevitably, Earl Glendith Acrai, who felt cheated of his chance to torture the last Vadach to death, eventually discovered Corum was alive and where he was. And so he gathered up his Denledesi as well as several local barbarians hostile to Moidal's Mount known as the Pony Tribes and laid siege to the castle. Luckily, Moidal's Mount was an island connected to the mainland only by a land bridge that was visible at low tide. Still, they were outnumbered, and Earl Glendith Acrai was determined to have Vadach blood. Of course, he was also happy to kill any of his fellow Mabden who sided with Corum, because Earl Glendith really is just that kind of scumbag bad guy. Desperate to save her people, Ralina invoked an ancient forbidden spell that did scare off Earl Glendith's army, but ended up putting her and Corum in the power of a dangerous shape-shifting sorcerer named Shul. Shul was incredibly arrogant and dreamed of becoming a god, and it was because of this that he was willing to make Corum a deal. Shul believed that the best way for him to become a god was to obtain the heart of one of the Lords of Chaos, in this case Ariok, the Knight of the Swords. As a way of protecting himself from harm, Ariok's heart was separate from his body and kept in a different chamber. Shul figured that Corum would be his cat's paw. If the prince in the scarlet robe would steal Ariok's heart and bring it to Shul, Shul would release Ralina and Corum from their captivity. Having not exactly a strong bargaining position, Corum had little choice but to agree. To aid his reluctant ally in this endeavor, Shul presented Corum with something to replace that which Glendith Acrai had taken from him: an eye and a hand. According to Shul, long ago, before law and chaos, before even the cosmic balance, there were the lost gods, brothers, Queel and Rune. They were the mightiest beings to have ever existed, stronger even than the most powerful of the lords of the higher realms. Bound to no law save one, that they were forbidden to inflict violence upon one another. And eventually even this law they broke. In their fight, Rune struck off one of Queel's hands, and Queel gouged out one of Rune's eyes. The lost gods thus earned their name, disappearing and never being seen since. How convenient that Corum himself lacked a hand and an eye. And so these two magical artifacts were grafted onto his body in their place by Shul. The Eye of Rune is a massive orb, bigger than an ordinary eye, covered in jewels so that it looks like the eye of a giant insect. The hand of Queel is equally bejeweled and carries 6 fingers, so that it looks like an incredibly ornate silver gauntlet. The Hand of Queel has a mind of its own and sometimes acts without Corum's volition. It also is incredibly strong, able to crush even the hardest substances with ease. When not covered by an eye patch, the Eye of Rune allows Corum to perceive a strange, shadowy limbo, a cave filled with the shades of those who have recently been killed in the service of the Eye and the Hand. Corum can use the Hand to summon the shades into the real world to fight on his behalf. However, they will only do so if they are promised prizes. Which is to say, the shades will then kill some of Corum's enemies and take the bodies back with them to their realm. Thus, the shades free themselves from bondage to the wearer of the Hand and the Eye by having others take their place. These, in turn, need to be summoned and claim prizes of their own to obtain their own liberty. And so Corum begins his quest to seek the realm of Ariok and steal his heart so as to secure the release of his beloved Ralina. But even if he succeeds in stealing the heart, how will he possibly contend with the Knight of the Swords once Ariok discovers the theft? And even if he overcomes this Lord of Chaos, what of the other two, Shambarg and Mabeloda? Well, you're going to have to read and/or listen to the stories to find out.